All right, welcome back to another fabulous, wonderful edition of Cosmic Cliff Notes, coalescing conversations from the outer realms of understanding to speak to your inner child. And what's beautiful is, as we mentioned, the intention of this, as I repeat, is to bring all these incredible discoveries, thought currents, um, and research information that we as a society have really branched off into sort of the cosmos, into specific fields, um, including quantum computing, including channeling, venture capital, society building, um, and even more esoteric than that, but I'll leave it there. So what's happening is we're seeing this, bifurcation of unity in our world because of people's intense um, expertise in a particular field, a particular vertical. And last time we talked a bit about the scaffolding or the crystallization of the structure of your brain mapping itself based off of your reality, and how that crystalline structure is embedded in you as you go until you have an expansive or transcendent experience, which forces you to relook at your operating software. And what happens is, as I mentioned in Cliff Notes, we really dove deep into understanding how to upgrade your operating software. And that happens at the individual level. And it's a constant iterative process as you go through life, um, as you seek. After a while, if you get into routine and habits, that operating software becomes crystallized. Um, you basically say, my patterns fit this mold, and it becomes more solidified. And what's interesting is this maps to the fascia in terms of trauma. So, for example, your body stores traumatic experiences energetically that creates what you might perceive as knots in the fascia, but it's really a trapped energy through the fascia system, which is an energetic pathway through your body built off of crystalline, heavily watered structures. And if you address that trauma in the moment, it is much easier to remove than if you have ignored it for weeks, months, years. Um, because what happens is that trauma is sort of stuck in its energetic in container, but after a while it becomes more solid, more solidified. And one of the things you can look at is the application of whole body neurological rebooting after car accidents within a 24-hour time period to see really how that mitigates the effects of um, the psychological impacts of whiplash. Um, Another thing is how if you hold deep-seated issues within you with someone, then it just stirs up your inner space more and more, um, and it boils over in an emotional outburst, or you just hold that deep-seated resentment for a very long time, and it affects your interaction, and it basically creates challenges in your life, but it starts to crystallize your view of a particular person or situation that you don't want to address, so you build a scaffolding around addressing that. And that's really a lot of the science behind the incompletions that and engrams focus on as well in your neurological mapping, such as you had a traumatic experience when you were a kid, a dog bit you when you were 7, and now you're deathly afraid of dogs, even like the cute, cuddly ones, because you didn't have an opportunity to process that trauma in that moment or shortly thereafter. And so you go through a transformative experience to relive it and release it until the bond breaks and the trauma is released. And even with Rolfing or myofascial work, those knots in our body that are actually trapped energy in our fascia release a similar emotional experience that triggers the memory of the trauma that was stored. And so a challenge with this is if we don't release that trauma, it's stored in our energetic DNA. It's encoded in our energetic blueprint, which we pass on to our progeny. We pass on to the next generation. And this, of course, is theory, but it's rooted in a lot of. So I'm going to be very clear. This is a theoretical statement rooted in stringing together a bunch of different multidisciplinary studies. So I'm very clear with that, right? But I'm also very clear that it intuitively makes a lot of sense. Is that we talk about how the epigenetics get passed on from generation to generation, up to 10 generations of, DNA, junk DNA that you receive, which is why you might have many similar characteristic traits of your ancestors, or you tend to pursue the same types of topics. Um, well, your trauma also gets passed on in this way, and so one of the more interesting challenges is that your genetic coding comes with a certain scaffolding associated with it. And what you'll find is that certain communities revolve around a certain type of scaffolding that has been crystallized. And it becomes very challenging to break that scaffolding pattern from a community perspective. You can do it from an individual perspective. Say you have a transcendent experience, you can very easily leave the community of tradition and standards because you've had that transcendent experience. You have to reformulate your crystallized or your operating software to handle that transcendent experience that goes beyond what your cultural framework or society's framework has established. And that's one of the things that we're seeing happening as one of the bigger challenges when we enter into community development and community involvement. And there's this incredible uh, uh, paper that talks about this same kind of scaffolding, uh, which I'm going to pull up right now, and it's culture. It's called cultural scaffolding, and it really is about the crystallization of what has already been created in our society, and just how much effort and energy goes in and has gone into creating structures and systems in that particular way. So that way, if you're offering change from a societal level, you are interacting with the crystallization of the society that you're interacting with. And so, just like you have when you interact with an individual who is very set in their ways, their scaffolding is crystallized, it may be very challenging for you to help them transcend those moments without a direct experience, such as the ability that's well documented on being able to roll coconuts with your third eye. If your cultural, if your individual scaffolding is open to um, childlike joy, wonder, amazement, and just anything is possible, then believing that statement is far easier to be received than if you were dead set in your ways on the limitations of Newtonian physics and cause and effect, with no consideration for more of the Eastern scientific studies. So then you have to have, in order to break that person's scaffolding, you have to have them undergo a transcendent experience themselves. And that's one of the biggest challenges of individuals who themselves have gone through like a hero's journey where they've had that transcendent experience and they're reformulating their mental model and their scaffolding. And that's why they tend to be attracted to those who are open to that kind of thing as a possibility. They may not themselves have had that transcendent experience of themselves rolling the coconut with their mind, but it is allowable to honor and appreciate that that's a possibility, rather than those who are very crystallized in their way, saying no, that can't be true, and that video is a scam, and all these reasons to reject the possibility that your experience is truth. And so when we look at the cultural scaffolding, what that goes into is really the energy and the collective consciousness that has gone toward building and maintaining the scaffolding of the community. So one of the areas you can look at is look at really old companies and their culture. Why is it so challenging to change their culture? It's because the scaffolding has been set up and maintained in such a way that it's now started to crystallize. And to actually make a change in that culture means you have to put in more energy than what has contained the structure for all those years, all those cumulative years. And there's a beautiful equation, a mathematical framework that I've developed and working with that explains this. And I'm understanding the different layers that it can be applied to. Because remember, it's about grounding it into now, grounding it into society, and making it easy to understand. And if you have a bunch of parameters and some of this and alpha that, beta that, a little confusing. Same thing, you can look at the loose scaffolding of startups and just how fast they adopt new processes, new culture. It's because they haven't had that solidification, that crystallization yet. And so these technology companies, these startups, are very quick at iterating their cultural scaffolding. The challenge is that rapid of a transformation renders it fairly vulnerable to issues. And we're seeing that in startups. Startups have lots of cultural issues. Because it's in a way and what they say is in startups is your first 5 hires will determine the rest of your startup success. Why? Because you are replicating from yourself and maybe one or two or a few co-founders, which has a culture and a dynamic around it. You're bringing in another person who has an entirely different mental scaffolding, different energy, different way of doing things, which impacts culture. And from a social level, it's very clear. If you have 2 people who are founders, then when you bring in that first new hire, then things start to shift and change in a very interesting way. But your second person you bring in will shift a little more. And what they've noticed is it's the first 5 people you add onto your team beyond the founders that really creates the blueprint and foundational scaffolding for how the company is going to grow and if it's going to be successful or not. So of course, this is also indexed to, their skills, knowledge, capabilities, and network from a business perspective, but from an energetic perspective and a crystallization of the scaffolding of which the company emerges is what I'm speaking to. So we look at entities or companies as a composition of many different individuals working on a task and hoping to achieve alignment and success, most notably financial surplus or profit. From an energetic framework, what you're doing is you're birthing an entity. When you start a company, you're birthing an entity that has its own energy. And so that's what I'm talking about, is that each founder and each top first 5 employees are your core architects for how the company is going to go. And of course, you can do a lot of work with that scaffolding as founders through the founding process, which is something I've led over a dozen startups with, which creates a much more solid framework that allows for new hires to understand on how to really align with that rather than be very wavy and wishy-washy about it, which creates some cultural instability. But understand that the culture of organizations is a prime example of the looseness of the scaffolding, and those tried and true 100+ year companies, their culture is a more crystallized scaffolding. Just like if you had a fight with your significant other the other day, it's much easier to repair that relationship than, say, a argument you had with your significant other 5 years ago, right? Because you've been holding on to it for so long, it's been crystallizing, and it becomes far more entangled with other issues and tensions. And one of the grandma's wisdom is, don't go to bed without resolving a fight with your significant other, right? I mean, so that's the energetic reason why. And taking it a step further, this cultural scaffolding, when you look at what's going on today, you're seeing why certain things don't change, or why certain things aren't really coming to a resolution and a transcendent experience. And racial tensions is one such thing, is because there's so much energy supporting the scaffolding of the culture in certain parts of the country, and you can say the country in general, that individual pockets of activity with a certain focused amount of energy won't be able to actually address the crystallization of the scaffolding that has been embedded in the culture for so many years, centuries, because of the combined energy that has gone to holding it in place. And some of the newer realizations is that with the advent of technology, we can really empower the collective decision to make incisive shifts and changes to our cultural scaffolding. And that's a really powerful thing. And it's known in general society of having a cultural movement, or a phenomenon where everyone's focused on one thing. And for the core underpinnings of what the United States of America is based off of, in actuality, not in fluff, but in actuality, it requires an intense amount of focused, incisive energy to make that shift, because you're addressing a core foundation of the framework that we've been built upon. And when you enter into those realms of core foundations, almost first principles in reality, the need to be laser-like and focused is even greater. It's similar to the beachhead approach for startups. Uber didn't take over the entire world with ride sharing at the start. What they did was they were very incisive and focused on, what is it, like black limousine services in San Francisco, because it created such an incisive opportunity and very focused because there was only so many uh, there's only so much resources in terms of capacity of consciousness and technology that you if you were going to make a shift in the ride hailing industry, you had to find something that you could really make a shift in the cultural scaffolding. And whether it's a societal movement that is addressing core underpinnings of inequality, or it's a startup looking at changing the landscape of making some part of commerce or of day-to-day life better, it's really important to understand exactly what part of the cultural scaffolding you're going after and be very incisive about that. And the more deeply ingrained that scaffolding has been, the more it has crystallized in society. Just recognize that it's going to require more energetic resources in the forms of talent, time, money, technology. And my final point here is what I could say to a 4-year-old. Maybe a 6-year-old. When you are baking brownies, not brownies, right? We'll go back to the brownies, and I'm working on the fly, so I appreciate the patience here. I would have to explain. Okay, when you put something in the oven gets hot, right? And the heat uh, comes from energy, right? It comes from electrical energy and then conventional, whatever. It's just energy, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to make brownies, and this batter, right, is a recognition of uh, new new ingredients, right? We threw a bit of flour in there, a bit of sugar, definitely some chocolate in there. We mixed it all up, right? But if you put your hands in it, it's very gooey, right? It's very moldable. You can separate this part from this part and lick your fingers. But the main point is you can pull it apart, you can put it back in, you can reconfigure it however you want, right? It's fairly loose. But once we put it in the brownie pan and put it in the oven, where it's exposed to a certain amount of energy in the form of heat, what happens? Well, that gooiness starts to harden. Now, of course, it hardens because, evaporation is part of it and this, that, and the other. But please, it's a 4-year-old metaphor here. So we can go into like the bond angles of water and how the removal of the removal of water actually makes it more solid. But the point is, you take the brownie sheet out, right? And now instead of this gooey stuff, you have hard, I mean, hopefully like moist at the very least, but a hard shape where you can no longer put your hands in and mix it and play with it. It's because the structure of the gooiness has been exposed to a certain amount of energy that has started to crystallize in the form of a beautiful, yummy brownie. But you can't move around the cooked brownie in a way where you could before you exposed it to energy. And so in that way, you can look at the cultural phenomenons from that landscape and the amount of energy required to address the cultural scaffolding. So, for example, if you're building on top of a recent cultural phenomenon or addressing it, it's far easier to do so from an energetic perspective because it hasn't crystallized than going after something that has had the collective consciousness's um, advocacy or at the very least um, silent letting it happen for many centuries. So, just like that, when you go out in your day to day, in your interpersonal relationships, think about the scaffolding you have. Think about the scaffolding they have. If there's an issue or traumatic experience that happens to you, are you processing it daily to remove it? Or are you waiting for it to crystallize a little bit more so it gets a little more tough to do, tough to remove? If you have an argument or an issue with someone, are you addressing it as soon as possible, or are you holding on to it deep down inside? Are you a startup that's looking to address an issue in society that hasn't been changed for hundreds of years? Or are you a startup looking for an entry point that may not be so big or foundational? Are you a cultural movement that's going after a foundational core underpinning of society? Then recognize that you need a correlated amount of energy to actually shift that scaffolding. And more importantly, the more energy you have, the more challenging it is to be clear and incisive and structured in really what it is that you're going after a change. And we as a society have seen it in a positive lens with our desire to ban straws, right? Um, Look, it's a straw. How much impact can it actually have? Well, it doesn't matter because it's us moving consciousness collectively one notch. And what's great is that one action has a very clear marketing message to it, has a very clear narrative, and we all can do it, and it's a very minimal change, and it's beneficial for many companies, so we can do it. And so when you're looking to shift something as big as a well adopted principle of society, think about something that is very clear that you're going after. So we're seeing it happen now with very clear statements that are very focused. This is what it's about. And when you have such a large movement that you're going after, that's a core underpinning of the foundations of society, just like in a startup, you need that beachhead. You need that clear, incisive win with that clear, incisive message that people can rally all that energy into a clear move. And one of the challenges or interesting perception, we'll save for another day because I want to stay very positive here. Another thing of thinking about it is, say you're baking just what is a good one? Like thickness. What is? Oh, I need to brush up on my baking analogies here. This will be fun. Don't want to use steak, but I'll use steak. Okay? Yeah, fine. Okay. A casserole? Lasagna. Lasagna. There we go. We'll go with a beautiful lasagna, like a vegetarian lasagna. Why not? And it has layers, right? You might have a lasagna that has just a few layers. It might be very thin, and you put it in the oven, you bake it, and you don't need to bake it for that long. Compared to if your lasagna has many different layers on it, it may take more time to cook all the way through into that middle. So, the inner child, my question to you is, whether it's you and your relationship to you in a relationship to another, your company in relationship to society, or a movement in relationship to a nation, how many layers are on your lasagna? Because that'll help you consider how much energy you need. And just like if you cut a lasagna in half before you put it in the oven, it reduces that amount of energy needed because it maximizes the surface area. Same thing too. What incisive action are you going for the resolution? What is that tension you are there to resolve? And how clear can you be and specific and almost micro focused to move that needle? Because that will lead you to success far greater than a grandiose statement. And you can build upon success. And that's what we want to do. We want to build upon success, especially if it's changing our relationship to ourselves for the better, relationship to others for the better, a relationship to business and society, our relationship to the nation. So, with that, I thank you for following along and hope you enjoyed it and look forward to our next one of these. All right, see ya. Oh, like, comment, subscribe. Feedback is great. Please, if there's something I'm conveying that might be inaccurate or confusing or whatever, please message me, comment, whatever. I mean, it's all about distilling these cosmic truths from a multidisciplinary perspective in a way that your inner child would receive. So today's lesson is all about baking brownies and the number of layers on your lasagna. And if it's too much to cook, cut it in half with an incisive, focused strike. Okay, have a great one.